Most television shows get accused of something once, a bad joke lands wrong, a character reads as offensive to someone, an apology gets issued, a writer gets a note, and the show moves on. The Simpsons has been accused of racism for 3 decades straight, and it is still on the air. It has been the subject of a feature documentary made by a comedian who loved the show and felt it had hurt him anyway. It has had a voice actor step down from a role he held for 30 years and then go on a podcast to apologize to every Indian person in the country. It has had episodes quietly removed from streaming platforms in Hong Kong without explanation. It has had an entire episode banned from broadcast in Japan because of what it did to the emperor. It has had its creator tell the press that people love to pretend they are offended, and then had to watch his lead actor spend years proving that the offense was real. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, this video walks slowly through every time Springfield found itself on the wrong side of that conversation. Welcome to Yellowfan, let's get started. The show that everyone loved and no one questioned. There is a particular kind of television show that arrives at just the right moment, in just the right cultural climate, and becomes something larger than entertainment. It becomes a shared language. It becomes the thing that families talk about at breakfast the next morning, the thing that coworkers quote to each other without even realizing they are quoting it, the thing that children grow up absorbing so completely that its values and its jokes and its way of seeing the world feel less like a television show and more like the air itself. The Simpsons was that kind of show. And for a very long time, because of exactly that status, almost nobody looked too carefully at what it was actually saying about the people it put on screen. To understand why the accusations of racism that would eventually come felt so surprising to so many people, it helps to go back to the beginning. Not to the very first episode, but to the cultural moment the show arrived into. It was 1989. American primetime television was dominated by live-action family comedies. The Cosby Show had been the most watched program in America for years. Roseanne had recently arrived and was being praised for its honest portrayal of a working-class family. Family Ties was winding down, Full House had just started, into this landscape came a cartoon, an animated family sitcom on a network, Fox, that most people still did not take entirely seriously. The executives who greenlit it were not entirely sure what they had. The critics who reviewed it were not entirely sure how to categorize it. And the audience that watched it from the very first episode did not entirely understand that they were watching something that would still be running more than 3 decades later. What made The Simpsons different from everything else on television at that moment was its tone. It was not warm in the way that family television was supposed to be warm. Homer Simpson was not a wise father who learned lessons. He was selfish, impulsive, frequently cruel to his son, frequently oblivious to his wife, and driven almost entirely by the desire to eat, sleep, and avoid responsibility. Bart Simpson was not a lovable scamp with a good heart underneath his mischief. He was genuinely disruptive, genuinely contemptuous of authority, and designed to make adults uncomfortable. The show took the conventions of the American family sitcom and bent them until they looked absurd, and audiences loved it for exactly that reason. By the early 1990s, The Simpsons was not just popular, it was a phenomenon. Bart Simpson was on t-shirts, lunchboxes, and backpacks. The catchphrases spread faster than almost any phrase from any television show before it. Schools in the United States reportedly banned Bart Simpson merchandise because teachers felt the character was a bad influence on children. President George H.W. Bush in 1992 gave a speech in which he said that American families should be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. The show responded by airing a clip of Homer watching the speech on television and saying that the Simpsons were just like the Waltons because both families were praying for an end to the Depression. It was the kind of moment that defined what the show was: quick, sharp, willing to punch at anything, and completely unafraid of the political and cultural establishment. That willingness to punch at everything was for a long time the reason nobody thought to look at what the show was doing with race. The Simpsons satirized politicians, it satirized religion. It satirized capitalism, television itself, celebrity culture, American foreign policy, and the concept of the nuclear family. It seemed to spare nothing. And when a show presents itself as an equal opportunity satirist, as a thing that mocks everything and everyone, audiences tend to extend it a great deal of trust. The logic goes something like this: if a show is willing to make Homer Simpson look like a fool every single week, if it is willing to make American institutions look corrupt and stupid and self-serving, then surely it is not being lazy or careless when it depicts other cultures. Surely the same critical intelligence that drives the satire of everything else is also driving the way the show handles race. That assumption held for a very long time. Through the 1990s, The Simpsons built an enormous cast of recurring characters around the central family. Springfield became a town populated by dozens of personalities, each one defined by a handful of traits, each one designed to be instantly recognizable and easily caricatured. There was the corrupt and incompetent mayor. There was the greedy and heartless boss. There was the alcoholic bartender. There was the lovable but dim police chief. There was the overly enthusiastic neighbor. These were archetypes, and the show deployed them with genuine wit. The jokes were usually not about the archetypes themselves, but about the gap between what the archetype was supposed to represent and what it actually did. But Springfield also contained other characters. Characters defined not by their personality quirks or their professional roles, but first and foremost by their ethnic or national identity. There was Apu, the Indian convenience store owner. There was Luigi, the Italian restaurateur with the thick accent and the checkered tablecloths. There was Groundskeeper Willie, the hot-tempered Scottish groundskeeper. There was Bumblebee Man, the slapstick Mexican television personality. There was Akira, the Japanese martial arts instructor. These characters were not presented with the same level of ironic distance that the show applied to its white American characters. They were not archetypes being gently mocked. They were in many cases simply stereotypes presented without the layer of critical commentary that would have transformed them into something more. The distinction matters, and it is one that took years for public conversation about the show to clearly articulate. When Homer is greedy and lazy and impulsive, the joke is not that Americans are greedy and lazy and impulsive. The joke is about Homer specifically, about the specific failure of this specific man to be what he imagines himself to be. The show is generous enough to Homer that his flaws feel human rather than representative. When Apu speaks in a thick Indian accent while running a convenience store and having an arranged marriage and fathering 8 children and working 24 hours a day 7 days a week, the joke is not about Apu specifically. It is about the idea of an Indian immigrant in America. There is no layer of irony protecting the character from being simply a collection of associations. He is the accent. He is the store. He is the stereotype made animated and given a name. But in the early years of the show, this was not the conversation that was happening. The conversation that was happening was about how remarkable it was that an animated series was doing this kind of bold, intelligent satire at all. Critics praised the writing. Academics began to take the show seriously as a cultural object. Books were written about its philosophy, its literary references, its political commentary. The show won Emmy Awards. It attracted guest stars from every corner of American public life. And the more prestigious the show became, the less anyone wanted to be the person asking uncomfortable questions about it. There is also the matter of what was normal in American television at that time. Simpsons did not invent the practice of white actors voicing non-white characters. It did not invent the use of ethnic stereotypes for comic purposes. Both of those practices had been present in American entertainment for decades across cartoons, across comedies, across a huge range of media. What The Simpsons did was absorb those practices into a show that was otherwise considered smart and progressive, which made them invisible in a particular way. If a low-quality cartoon used a stereotyped accent for a character of color, that was something people might notice and criticize. When The Simpsons did it, it was wrapped in so much genuine wit and intelligence that the stereotyping seemed like it must be intentional, must be part of the satire, must be doing something more sophisticated than it appeared. The show's progressive credentials on other fronts also served as cover. The Simpsons was one of the first major American television programs to feature an openly gay character treated with genuine dignity. It addressed environmental issues, corporate corruption, religious hypocrisy, and the failures of the American political system with a consistency and a sharpness that most live-action dramas would not attempt. Viewers who cared about those issues extended goodwill to the show that made it harder to see where the goodwill was not warranted. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the show's ratings began to decline from their peak, but its cultural presence remained enormous. By this point, it had become something close to an institution. Long-running institutions develop a kind of immunity to scrutiny simply through the passage of time. Things that have been around for 20 years begin to feel like things that have always been around. And things that have always been around begin to feel like things that are simply part of the landscape, rather than choices that can be questioned. Apu had been on The Simpsons since 1990. A child who had grown up watching the show from its earliest seasons was now in their 20s or 30s. The character had been present for so long that criticizing him felt to many people like criticizing something fundamental. Not a choice that writers had made, but a fixture of American cultural life. This is the environment into which the eventual criticism would arrive. Not a show that had been hiding from scrutiny, but a show that had been so thoroughly embraced, so completely woven into American cultural fabric, and so consistently praised for its intelligence that the idea of examining it critically on racial grounds seemed almost counterintuitive to the people who loved it. The accusations, when they came, would feel to many longtime fans like an attack on something sacred. To the people making the accusations, they were simply pointing at something that had been visible the whole time. What made The Simpsons unique was also what made The Reckoning, when it came, so complicated and so public. This was not a forgotten show. This was not a fringe product that only a small audience had seen. This was one of the most watched, most discussed, most culturally significant television programs in American history. When questions about race and representation finally arrived at its door, they arrived at the door of something that almost everyone in America had an opinion about. That scale made the conversation louder, messier, more personal, and more difficult to resolve than almost any similar conversation that had happened about any other show. The Simpsons spent nearly 3 decades as the show that everyone loved and no one questioned. What happened next would reveal just how much that silence had been covering. The town of Springfield had been home to countless faces and countless voices for 30 years. But for one character in particular, the silence was about to end in a very loud way. The name on that convenience store was going to become one of the most debated names in the history of American television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 walked through the cultural dominance The Simpsons built over decades, and why that dominance created a kind of armor around the show that kept hard questions from being asked. Coming up next, we go inside the creation of the character who would eventually sit at the center of everything, the man behind the Quickie Mart counter, and how he got there. Section 2. Apu, the character who started a national conversation. There is something worth sitting with before getting into the details of how Apu Nahasape Maptilon was created, and what his creation eventually meant. It is the fact that for a very long time the character was not controversial at all. He was beloved, he was quoted, he was imitated. He was, by almost every available measure of popular affection, one of the most recognized and well-liked recurring characters on one of the most recognized and well-liked television programs in the world. Understanding how a character that was greeted with that kind of warmth eventually became the subject of a national conversation about racism requires going back to the beginning, to the specific decisions that were made when the character was first put together, and to the cultural assumptions that made those decisions feel not just acceptable, but genuinely good at the time. The Simpsons premiered in December of 1989. Apu appeared for the first time in the 8th episode of the first season, in an episode called The Telltale Head, which aired in February of 1990. His role in that episode was small. He was the owner of the Quickie Mart convenience store, a place where Homer and Bart stopped regularly, and his function was largely transactional. He sold things, he reacted to the Simpson family, he had a handful of lines. But even in those first appearances, the character had a specific identity that was already fully formed. He spoke with a heavy Indian accent. He was industrious and hardworking to the point of parody, running his store at all hours. He was polite, deferential, and defined almost entirely by his relationship to his business. The voice behind Apu was Hank Azaria, a white Jewish actor from Queens, New York, who had joined the cast of The Simpsons in its earliest days and would go on to voice dozens of characters across the show's run, including Moe the bartender, Chief Wiggum the police chief, and Comic Book Guy. Azaria was by all accounts a genuinely talented voice actor, capable of producing a wide range of distinct and memorable vocal performances. The voice he created for Apu was based, as he would later acknowledge publicly, on Peter Sellers' performance in a 1968 film called The Party, in which Sellers, a white British actor, played an Indian character using heavy brown face makeup and an exaggerated Indian accent. Sellers' performance in that film had itself been criticized by Indian audiences at the time of its release, though that criticism had largely faded from mainstream American awareness by the time Azaria was developing Apu's voice in 1989 and 1990. This is one of the first and most revealing threads in the story of how Apu came to be. The direct lineage between Sellers' brownface performance in 1968 and Azaria's vocal performance beginning in 1990 was not hidden. Azaria himself would eventually speak about it openly. What it reveals is that the creative foundation of the character was not built on observation or on genuine engagement with Indian culture or Indian American experience. It was built on an existing caricature. One white actor's exaggerated impersonation of an Indian person became the model for another white actor's exaggerated impersonation of an Indian person. And that second impersonation went on to be heard by millions of people every week for 3 decades. Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, has spoken about his own intentions with the character in interviews over the years, and his framing is worth examining carefully. Groening has said that he named the character Apu after the protagonist of the Apu trilogy, a celebrated series of films made by the Indian director Satyajit Ray in the 1950s and 1960s. Ray's trilogy is considered one of the great achievements of world cinema, a deeply humanistic and emotionally precise portrait of poverty, family, and life in Bengal. Groening has said that by naming the Simpsons character after Ray's protagonist, he intended to signal a kind of cultural respect and scholarly seriousness. He has said he hoped that children watching the show might be curious enough about the name to seek out Ray's films. This is a genuinely unusual claim, and it is worth taking seriously as a statement of intention, while also recognizing what it does not explain. Whatever the origin of the name, the character on screen bore essentially no resemblance to the character in Ray's films. The Apu of the Apu trilogy is a child then a young man, navigating poverty and loss and aspiration in rural and urban Bengal with a dignity and a complexity that Ray spent 3 films carefully developing. The Apu of The Simpsons ran a convenience store, spoke in an accent designed to make American audiences laugh, and was defined by a set of traits that had nothing to do with Ray's work and everything to do with the most familiar associations that American popular culture had built around Indian immigrants. A scholarly name attached to a caricatured body does not produce a respectful character. It produces a character whose creation involved the kind of selective borrowing that takes cultural prestige from one place while delivering cultural stereotype to another. Through the 1990s, as the show grew in popularity and the character of Apu became more developed, he acquired a backstory that gave him more dimensions than his first appearances had suggested. It was revealed that Apu had a doctorate in computer science from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. He had come to the United States on a student visa and had never completed the paperwork to become a legal citizen, a storyline explored in the Season 7 episode Much Apu About Nothing. He eventually married a woman named Manjula in an arranged marriage and went on to father octuplets. He had a brother named Sanjay. He was deeply religious, a practicing Hindu who kept a shrine to Ganesha behind the Quickie-Mart counter. He was shown to be honest, hardworking, and genuinely caring about the community around him. These additions gave Apu a life beyond the convenience store counter. Writers who worked on the show during this period have pointed to these details as evidence that the character was being treated with care, that there was a genuine attempt to make him more than a one-dimensional figure. And in the context of American television in the 1990s, that argument had some validity. Indian characters on American television were almost entirely absent. Apu was, for many years, one of the only recurring Indian characters on any major American television program. For some Indian American viewers, that presence, however imperfect, felt like something. A reflection, however distorted, of a community that television otherwise pretended did not exist. But the complexity added to the character over the years existed alongside the original architecture of the character, which never changed. The accent never changed. The association with the convenience store never changed. The deference, the politeness, the way the character functioned as a supporting presence in stories about white American characters rather than as the center of his own stories, these things remained constant. You could give Apu a doctorate. You could give him 8 children and a detailed family history. But if the fundamental grammar of how he existed on screen was the grammar of a caricature, the additions did not transform the character. They decorated it. The catchphrase that became most associated with Apu was a line he delivered in various forms across many episodes. "Thank you, come again." It was a simple phrase, spoken in the exaggerated accent, repeated so often that it became one of the most quoted lines from the entire series. And it was that phrase, more than anything else about the character, that defined what Apu meant in American schools and American neighborhoods and American workplaces through the 1990s and 2000s. Not his doctorate, not his religious devotion, not his complicated immigration status. The phrase that entered the cultural vocabulary was the one that reduced him to a transaction. A service worker, grateful for your business, sending you on your way. For Indian American children growing up during this period, the experience of that phrase was not the same as the experience of it for children who did not share Apu's ethnic background. This is something that would be documented extensively later. But the pattern was already in place long before anyone made a documentary about it. A child with Indian heritage would walk into a classroom or a cafeteria and hear a classmate put on the accent and say, "Thank you, come again." And the laughter that followed was not the laughter of people who found the joke in the incongruity or the absurdity. It was the laughter of recognition, of a shared cultural signal, of a joke that worked precisely because it reduced an entire community of people to the same set of sounds. The joke was not about Apu. The joke was about anyone who could be Apu. Anyone with that kind of name, that kind of accent, that kind of heritage. This is what the character was doing in the real world, beyond the television screen and the animated streets of Springfield. It was providing a template, a set of sounds and associations that people could reach for when they wanted to signal something about Indian immigrants, or about South Asian people more broadly, without having to articulate what they were actually saying. The character had such wide cultural penetration that the template was available to almost everyone. You did not need to have watched the show carefully, or thought about the character at all. You just needed to have been in American culture during the 1990s, and the sounds were already in your head. The writers and producers of The Simpsons were not, in most cases, people who had grown up in that environment. They were, with very few exceptions, white Americans, and the writer's room where these characters were developed and refined was for most of the show's history almost entirely white. This is not an accusation of malice. The evidence strongly suggests that the people who created and voiced Apu believed they were doing something harmless and even affectionate. But the gap between what they believed they were doing and what the character was actually doing in the world is precisely the gap that the eventual criticism would try to describe. And for a very long time, because the writer's room was not populated by people who had the experience of being called Apu in a school hallway, that gap was invisible to the people most responsible for the character. By the time The Simpsons entered its second decade, Apu Nahasape Maptilon was one of the most recognizable characters in American animation. He had his own action figure, his voice was imitated constantly. His catchphrase was embedded in the culture, and the conversation about what all of that meant had not yet begun. It would begin eventually with a comedian from Brooklyn who had grown up watching the show and loving it, and who had spent years trying to figure out exactly why one of his favorite characters made him feel the way it did. That comedian and the film he eventually made would change the conversation around The Simpsons in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. The character behind the Quickie Mart counter had been there for nearly 30 years by the time that conversation finally arrived. What came next would be loud, complicated, and deeply revealing about the show, its creators, and the culture that had embraced both for so long without asking too many questions. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 2 traced how Apu was built from the ground up, from the Peter Sellers imitation that shaped his voice to the catchphrase that became a weapon in school hallways across America. Next, we go to 2017 and the documentary that finally put all of this into words, named the problem clearly, and set everything that followed into motion. Section 3. The Problem with Apu. Hari Kondabolu's documentary. There is a particular kind of frustration that builds slowly, over many years before it finds its shape. It is not the sharp frustration of a single incident. It is the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments, each one individually manageable, each one easy to brush aside, but collectively forming something that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. For Hari Kondabolu, that frustration had been building since childhood. He had grown up watching The Simpsons, he had loved the show. He had laughed at Apu, the way almost everyone around him laughed at Apu, because the show was funny and the character was well written and the jokes were clever. But alongside the laughter there was always something else. Something that did not have a clean name for a long time, but that sat in the background of every viewing experience, present and unresolved. Kondabolu was born in 1982 in Flushing, Queens, to parents who had immigrated to the United States from India. He grew up in a neighborhood with a large South Asian population, attended school in New York, and developed an interest in comedy from a young age. By his late teens and early 20s he was performing stand-up, and by his 30s he had established himself as a thoughtful and politically engaged comedian, whose work frequently engaged with questions of race, immigration, and representation in American culture. He had appeared on late-night television programs, he had a podcast. He was, by any reasonable measure, a successful working comedian with a genuine platform. But through all of that, the question of Apu stayed with him. Not as an obsession, but as an unresolved piece of business. Something he kept returning to, kept thinking about, kept trying to articulate to audiences and to himself. He had made jokes about the character in his stand-up sets for years. He had talked about the experience of being a South Asian child in America, and having classmates deploy the Apu accent as a form of mockery. He had described in various performances and interviews over the years the specific texture of that experience, the way it was never quite mean enough to feel like a clear act of cruelty, the way it was always wrapped in the cover of just joking, the way it drew on a character that the whole culture had decided was funny and harmless and above reproach. At some point, Kondabolu decided that a stand-up bit was not the right container for everything he wanted to say about this. The subject was too large, too layered, too connected to things that went beyond his own personal experience. What he wanted to make was a documentary. Not an angry documentary, not a polemic, but a careful and honest examination of how a single fictional character had managed to shape the way an entire community of people was perceived in American culture, and what that said about the way television had historically treated communities of color. The documentary he made was called The Problem with Apu. It was produced for the American cable network truTV and premiered in November of 2017. It ran for approximately 49 minutes. In the scale of documentary filmmaking, it was a modest production. But the conversation it started was anything but modest. The film opens with Kondabolu establishing his own relationship to the show. He is not presenting himself as someone who hated The Simpsons, or who came to the subject as an outsider. He came to it as a fan. A genuine, long-time, deeply knowledgeable fan who had spent years wrestling with the contradiction of loving a show that contained something that hurt people who looked like him. That framing was deliberate and important. It made it harder to dismiss the documentary as the work of someone who simply did not understand or appreciate the show. Kondabolu understood it very well. That was precisely why the problem with Apu was for him so difficult to let go. One of the central arguments the documentary makes is about representation and scarcity. When Apu was introduced in 1990, Indian characters on American primetime television were essentially non-existent. There were no Indian American leads in major American network dramas or comedies. There were almost no recurring Indian characters in any significant American television program. For a South Asian child growing up in America in the 1990s, Apu was not just a cartoon character. He was, in a very real and very limited way, the primary representation of people who looked like him and came from a heritage like his in the medium that American culture used most to tell itself stories about itself. This is a dynamic that the documentary explores with considerable care. Kondabolu interviews a range of Indian American and South Asian American performers and public figures, asking them about their own experiences with the character. The people he speaks with include Kal Penn, who became famous for the Harold and Kumar film series and later worked in the Obama White House. They include Asif Mandvi, who had been a correspondent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart for years. They include Hassan Minhaj, who would go on to host his own Netflix show. They include Sakina Jaffrey, who had appeared in the television drama House of Cards. They include Aziz Ansari, who by 2017 was one of the most recognizable South Asian faces in American entertainment as both a stand-up comedian and the creator and star of the Netflix series Master of None. What these interviews reveal cumulatively is a pattern that cuts across different generations, different levels of fame, different specific backgrounds within the broad category of South Asian American. Every single person Kondabolu speaks with has a version of the same story. They grew up seeing Apu. They watched their classmates, their colleagues, their neighbors reach for the Apu accent as a shorthand for mockery. They experienced the specific helplessness of having a piece of popular culture used against them in a way that the culture at large refused to take seriously because the source was a beloved television show that everyone had agreed was harmless. Kal Penn's contribution to the documentary is among its most striking moments. Penn, who had spent years navigating an American entertainment industry that consistently tried to push South Asian actors towards stereotype roles, describes his relationship to Apu with a directness that the documentary earns through its patient accumulation of context. He says simply and without embellishment that he hates Apu, not the show, not the writers, the character, the specific distillation of Indian identity into a set of sounds and associations that had made his professional life, and the professional lives of every South Asian actor of his generation, significantly harder to navigate. When an entire culture's primary image of what an Indian person sounds like and looks like, and does for a living, comes from a single animated character, the actors who are actually Indian find themselves auditioning in the shadow of that character constantly. Sakina Jaffrey speaks in the documentary about the practice she calls patanking, a term used in the South Asian American community to describe the exaggerated imitation of an Indian accent that non-Indian people perform. She explains that the word itself is meant to capture the sound of the accent as it is heard by someone who does not speak it naturally, the flattened, dismissive imitation that signals not engagement with a culture but reduction of it. The Apu voice, she argues, is a form of patanking elevated to national prominence, and repeated weekly to millions of viewers for 30 years. The scale of that repetition is part of what makes it so significant. It is not one person imitating an accent in one moment. It is a cultural institution endorsing a particular sonic representation of an entire community, over and over until that representation becomes synonymous with the community itself. The documentary also investigates how the Apu character was originally created, and this portion of the film is particularly revealing. Kondabolu tracks down and interviews Dana Gould, a writer who worked on The Simpsons for several seasons during the show's peak years. Gould speaks honestly about the dynamic inside the writer's room during the period when Apu was being developed and refined. He acknowledges that the accent was considered funny by the people in the room, and that the humor of the accent was inseparable from its foreignness, from the way it marked the character as other in relation to the white American characters who dominated the show. He does not present this as evidence of malice. He presents it as evidence of a blind spot. A room full of people who shared a particular cultural background, making decisions about how to depict people whose cultural background they did not share, without fully considering what those decisions would mean to the people being depicted. This is one of the documentary's most useful contributions to the conversation. It moves the discussion away from the question of intent and toward the question of impact. The question of whether the writers of The Simpsons intended to be racist when they created and maintained Apu over 30 years is, the documentary suggests, largely beside the point. The more important question is what the character actually did, what it communicated to the millions of people who watched it and absorbed its imagery, and what it meant to the community of people who found themselves represented by it, whether they wanted to be or not. Beyond the interviews and the historical investigation, the documentary also makes a broader argument about the relationship between representation and harm. Kondabolu draws a line between the specific case of Apu and a larger history of American popular culture, using caricatured representations of non-white communities as entertainment. He does not claim that Apu is equivalent to the most extreme historical examples of racist caricature in American entertainment. He does not need to make that equivalence for the argument to hold. What he argues is that the mechanism is the same. A community of people who have limited power to shape their own representation in mainstream media finds that representation shaped by people outside the community. And the resulting image reflects not the reality of the community, but the assumptions, the stereotypes, and the comedic shorthand available to the people doing the shaping. The documentary was released on True TV on November 19, 2017. The response was immediate and substantial. Critics praised it. The Hollywood Reporter, Variety, The New York Times, and a wide range of other publications covered it seriously and at length. Social media amplified it rapidly, both among people who found it persuasive and among people who did not. The Indian American community, broadly speaking, received it with a recognition that many people described as having something to do with finally. Finally, someone had named the thing that had been present for so long without a name. Not everyone agreed with the documentary's conclusions. There were Indian American voices who pushed back, arguing that Apu had been a source of complicated pride as well as pain, that the character's presence had at least meant visibility in a medium that otherwise ignored South Asian Americans entirely, and that removing or changing the character would not address the underlying conditions that had produced him. There were non-Indian voices who argued that The Simpsons satirized everyone equally, and that singling out Appa missed the larger context of the show's approach to character. These counter-arguments were real, and they reflected genuine disagreements within the communities most affected by the character. But the documentary had done something that counter-arguments could not entirely undo. It had put a face and a voice and a specific set of experiences on the conversation. It had made it impossible to discuss the Apu character in purely abstract terms anymore. When Kal Penn says on camera that he hates Apu, and explains exactly why, the conversation is no longer about whether a cartoon character is technically racist in some academic sense. It is about what that cartoon character did to a real person's life and career, and about what it did to the lives of children who grew up hearing its catchphrase used against them in hallways and classrooms and workplaces. Kondabolu himself was careful throughout the documentary to distinguish between his criticism of the character and his relationship to the show. He was not asking for The Simpsons to be cancelled. He was not asking for Apu to be erased from the record. He was asking for the conversation to be taken seriously. He was asking for the people responsible for the character to acknowledge what it had done, to engage with the people it had affected, and to think carefully about what came next. Whether the people responsible for the character would do that was a separate question entirely. The documentary had made the argument. What happened next depended on people who had spent nearly 30 years making different choices, and who were now being asked very publicly to reconsider them. The show that had been everyone's favorite was now at the center of a conversation it had not invited and was not entirely sure how to handle. And the first sign of how it would handle that conversation came a few months after the documentary's release, in a scene so brief and so strange that it managed to make the controversy significantly worse rather than better. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3 laid out everything Harry Kondabolu built in his documentary. The interviews, the arguments, the history, and the human cost of 30 years of a single caricature. Next, we look at how The Simpsons itself chose to respond, and why that response left almost everyone, on every side of the debate, deeply unsatisfied. Section 4. The show's response and why it backfired. When a show as large and as culturally embedded as The Simpsons finds itself at the center of a serious public controversy, the response it chooses to give carries enormous weight. Not just because of the size of the audience watching, but because of what the response signals about the people behind the show and their relationship to the criticism being leveled at them. A thoughtful response can open a conversation. A dismissive response can close one. And a response that tries to be clever about something that requires sincerity can do something worse than either of those things. It can make the people doing the criticizing feel mocked rather than heard, and it can make everyone watching feel like the institution being criticized is more interested in defending itself than in engaging honestly with what it is being asked to consider. The Simpsons' first substantive on-screen response to the controversy generated by Hari Kondabolu's documentary came in April of 2018, approximately 5 months after the problem with Apu had aired on True TV. The episode was called No Good Read Goes Unpunished, the 17th episode of the show's 29th season. Near the end of the episode, there is a scene that the writers clearly intended as the show's answer to the documentary, and it is that scene, lasting only a minute or two, that became the most discussed and most criticized moment in The Simpsons' recent history. The scene involves Marge and Lisa. Marge has been rereading a book she loved as a child, a story called The Princess in the Garden, a gentle parody of the classic novel The Secret Garden. Rereading it as an adult, Marge realizes the book is full of offensive stereotypes and racial caricatures she had not noticed when she was young. She tries to edit the book as she reads it aloud to Lisa, removing the offensive content. But the edited version turns out hollow and unsatisfying. The story has lost its texture. Marge looks at what she has produced and says, with resignation, that it takes a lot of work to take the spirit and character out of a book. Then Lisa turns to face the camera directly and speaks to the audience. She says, "Something that started decades ago and was applauded and inoffensive is now politically incorrect. What can you do?" The camera pans to show a framed photograph of Apu on Lisa's bedside table, signed with the words, "Do not have a cow." The implication is deliberate and unmistakable. The show is acknowledging the controversy, positioning Apu as what Marge's old book represents, and offering as its official position something close to helpless uncertainty. Marge then adds some things will be dealt with at a later date, and Lisa responds if at all. Before examining why this response landed so badly, it is worth acknowledging what the writers were probably trying to do. The scene is an attempt at the kind of self-aware meta-commentary that The Simpsons had built much of its reputation on. The show had always been willing to acknowledge its own existence as a cultural object, to wink at the audience, to fold its own position into the jokes. In that tradition, addressing the Apu controversy through Marge editing a racist old book is a recognizable creative move. The book is the show, the offensive content is Apu, Marge's frustration is the writer's frustration. The message, read charitably, is, "We know this is complicated, we are aware of the conversation, and we do not have a clean answer." Read that way, the scene is at least honest about uncertainty. It does not pretend the controversy does not exist. But the scene was not received charitably, and the reasons it was not received charitably are worth sitting with carefully. The first problem is the framing. By filtering the acknowledgement through the metaphor of an old children's book, the scene places the burden of discomfort on the people who found the original content offensive rather than on the people who created it. The implicit argument is not that the character was wrong. It is that the times have changed. Something that was fine before is now considered not fine, and the show is uncertain what to do about that. The phrase politically incorrect that Lisa uses in the scene carries a specific meaning in American cultural discourse. It is almost always used to suggest that the offense being taken is a matter of cultural fashion rather than genuine harm, that the problem lies with a hypersensitive contemporary audience rather than with the original content. By reaching for that phrase, the scene aligns itself with a perspective that many of the people most affected by the Apu character found deeply dismissive. The second problem is the question the scene asks. "What can you do?" Lisa says, and the show treats this as a genuine rhetorical question, a shrug at an impossible situation. But the people making the case against Apu had offered specific answers to that question. Kondabolu himself had named several publicly. The character could be rewritten to rely less on stereotype. He could be voiced by an Indian American actor. He could be given storylines that centered his own experience, rather than positioning him as a supporting presence in stories about white characters. South Asian writers could be brought into the room. None of these were mysterious suggestions. They had been made explicitly and publicly. The question, "What can you do?" only reads as genuine if no one has been listening to the answers already available. The third problem is tone. The scene is knowing and wry in a way the subject cannot accommodate. Irony works when the right answer is genuinely unclear. The experiences documented in Kondabolu's film were not unclear. The Indian American comedians who appeared in it and described being mocked with the Apu accent throughout their childhoods and professional lives were not describing something ambiguous. They were describing real harm sustained over real time. A wry fourth wall break with a signed photograph was not a response to those experiences. It was a deflection of them. Hari Kondabolu's public response to the scene was measured. He said on social media that the Simpsons' response was not a jab at him personally, but at what many people considered progress. He noted that the scene did not engage with any specific argument his documentary had made. It did not address why a white actor had voiced an Indian character for 30 years. It did not address the experiences of the performers who appeared in the film. It did not address how the character had shaped American perceptions of South Asian people. It said, in effect, that the situation was complicated and that something might be done eventually. Or might not. The public response was largely negative. Critics wrote about the scene as a missed opportunity. The New York Times, The Guardian, and Variety all covered the reaction extensively. The phrase "what can you do" became a shorthand for the worst version of institutional defensiveness. The acknowledgement that functions as a shield rather than an opening, the admission of complexity deployed to prevent change rather than enable it. The scene also revealed something about the assumptions the writers were carrying. The metaphor of Marge editing the racist old book suggests the writers understood the problem with Apu primarily as a problem of content, as specific offensive material that could theoretically be removed if the removal did not damage the surrounding story. But the criticism Kondabolu's documentary had made was not primarily about content. It was about structure. The problem was not that Apu said offensive things. The problem was that a white actor had been voicing an Indian character using an exaggerated Indian accent since 1990, that the character had been built on stereotype from its foundation, and that the writer's room had never included meaningful South Asian representation to challenge those choices from the inside. Editing individual jokes out of that structure would not have addressed the underlying condition, any more than editing individual sentences from a book written from cultural ignorance makes the book honest. The response also had consequences that extended beyond the immediate critical reaction. By framing the controversy as something the show could shrug at with a knowing wink, the writers made it harder for any subsequent action to feel like genuine engagement rather than reluctant compliance. The show had defined the terms of its own response before any real response had been decided, and those terms were not generous ones. In the months following the episode, Hank Azaria began speaking publicly about his own relationship to the character. His statements reflected a genuine struggle that the show's on-screen response had not. He said the idea that anyone had been bullied because of Apu made him sad. He said he had not intended harm. He said he was willing to step aside from the role if that was what the show and the community needed. Matt Groening took a different position. In May of 2018, he told USA Today he was proud of what the show did, and that it was a time in the culture when people love to pretend they are offended. That comment became a story of its own, widely reported and widely criticized. Groening later said the remark had not been specifically about Apu, but about what he described as outrage culture more broadly. He said the conversation had become tainted, and that there was no nuance left in it. The gap between Azaria's evolving discomfort and Groening's defensive posture became one of the most visible fault lines in the entire controversy, and it would continue to widen. What the show's initial response ultimately revealed was something about the limits of self-awareness as a substitute for accountability. The Simpsons had always presented itself as smarter and more knowing than other television programs. That intelligence had been a genuine asset for decades, but in this moment it became a liability. Being smart about a problem is not the same as addressing it. A show that had spent 30 years being praised for its intelligence found in this specific instance that intelligence deployed in the service of defensiveness produces nothing of value. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 4 traced the show's on-screen response and examined why a brief ironic scene managed to deepen the controversy rather than resolve it. Next, we follow the two very different paths taken by the show's creator and its lead voice actor, from Groening's "people love to pretend they're offended" comment, all the way to Azaria's eventual deeply personal apology on a podcast in 2021. Section 5, Matt Groening, Hank Azaria, and the long road to an apology. There is something quietly revealing about the way two people can experience the same controversy and arrive at completely different places. Not different in a subtle way, not different in the way that reasonable people sometimes land on opposite sides of a genuinely ambiguous question, but different in a way that seems to reflect something fundamental about how each person understood what was actually being asked of them. In the years following Hari Kondabolu's documentary and the widely criticized on-screen response that The Simpsons offered in the spring of 2018, the two men most publicly associated with the Apu character took paths that diverged so completely that by the time the dust had begun to settle, they seemed to have been responding to entirely different events. Matt Groening, the creator of the show and the man who had given the character his name and his foundational identity, moved toward defensiveness and remained there. Hank Azaria, the man who had given the character his voice for 30 years, moved slowly, carefully, and at considerable personal cost towards something that looked much more like genuine reckoning. Understanding both of those trajectories requires going back to the specific moments when each man spoke publicly about the controversy, examining not just what they said but the framing they chose, the language they reached for, and what both of those things reveal about where each person was standing when they looked at what the documentary had put in front of them. Matt Groening's first significant public comment on the Apu controversy came in May of 2018, in an interview he gave to USA Today on the occasion of The Simpsons breaking the record for the longest-running American primetime scripted television series. It was a celebratory interview, focused on the milestone the show had reached, and the Apu question arrived in that context. When the interviewer asked Groening whether he had thought about the backlash surrounding the character, his response was brief and immediate. He said he was proud of what the show did. And then he added the line that would follow him through the rest of the controversy. He said it was a time in the culture when people love to pretend they are offended. That sentence landed with considerable force. Not because it was surprising exactly, but because of its precision as a dismissal. The phrase "pretend they are offended" does not just push back against the specific criticism of Apu. It questions the sincerity of the people doing the criticizing. It suggests that the Indian-American comedians who had appeared in Kondabolu's documentary and described being mocked with the Apu accent throughout their lives were not genuinely describing genuine experiences of genuine harm. It suggests that the discomfort was performed rather than felt, that the offense was a cultural affectation rather than a response to something real. Coming from the creator of the character at the center of the controversy, in the same week that the show's on-screen response had already been widely criticized as dismissive, the comment felt to many people like a deliberate provocation. The reaction was swift. Kondabolu himself responded publicly, noting that the comment suggested Groening had not engaged seriously with anything the documentary had argued. Critics who had been willing to give the show some benefit of the doubt in the weeks after the No Good Read Goes unpunished episode found their patience significantly reduced. The phrase "people love to pretend they are offended" circulated widely as an example of exactly the kind of institutional defensiveness that had allowed the Apu situation to persist for so long. If the person responsible for creating the character believed that the people most affected by it were simply performing offense rather than experiencing harm, then the prospects for any genuine change seemed limited. Groening attempted to walk the comment back at least partially in a subsequent interview with the New York Times published in July of 2018. In that interview, he said that the USA Today comment had not been specifically about Apu, but about what he described as the broader culture of outrage that he had been observing for decades. He said there was an outrage of the week in American culture, that issues rose and fell in the public conversation with a regularity that he found troubling, and that he did not believe the Apapu controversy was necessarily the most important battle for people concerned about representation to be fighting. He also said that the conversation around Apu had become tainted, that it had lost whatever nuance it might have had at the beginning, and that he found the whole situation clunky and uncomfortable. He expressed in the same interview continued affection for the character. He reiterated the claim about naming Apu after the protagonist of Satyajit Ray's trilogy. He said he loved Indian culture and Indian cinema. He said he was not sure exactly how the situation was going to play out, but that he expected Apu to remain part of the show. He did not express regret for the character's creation. He did not engage with the specific experiences described by the Indian-American performers in Kondabolu's documentary. He did not address the question of why the character had been voiced by a white actor for 3 decades. The interview was, in tone and in substance, a defense of a position rather than a reconsideration of one. Later, when the 2020 recasting announcements came, and white actors were being replaced in non-white roles across the show, Groening spoke to the BBC and offered a comment that added another dimension to his overall position. He said that times change, but that he had not personally had a problem with the way the show had been doing things. He said that all of the show's actors played dozens of characters, and that the original casting had never been designed to exclude anyone. He said the show was trying to make things better. And then he added, with what appeared to be a combination of resignation and weariness, "At a certain point, it does not matter what you say, you are going to be attacked by whoever." That final observation, arriving in the context of a discussion about racial representation, carried the same undertone as the "pretend they are offended" comment from 2 years earlier. Both phrases located the problem not in the choices the show had made, but in the responses those choices had generated. Taken together, Groening's public comments across this period tell a consistent story. He was a man who believed he had acted in good faith, who was proud of his show and its legacy, who genuinely did not understand why the people criticizing him were not willing to credit that good faith, and who experienced the criticism primarily as an attack rather than as an invitation. None of that made him a villain, but it did mean that the show's reckoning with its own racial history, to the extent that it happened at all, would happen in spite of its creators' instincts, rather than because of them. Hank Azaria's journey through the same period was longer, more internal, and ultimately more public in a different way. In the immediate aftermath of the documentary, Azaria's public statements were careful and measured. He said he found the idea that anyone had been bullied because of Apu deeply upsetting. He said that had never been his intention. He said he wanted to bring laughter and joy. Those statements were genuine as far as they went, but they were also still largely framed around his own intentions, rather than around the impact of the character. They were the statements of someone who was troubled, and who was beginning to engage with the question, but who had not yet fully reckoned with the distance between what he had meant to do and what he had actually done. By early 2018, Azaria had moved further. In an appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, he said that the most important thing was to listen to Indian people and their experience with the character. He said he had been listening, and he said, directly and without significant hedging, that he was perfectly willing to step aside from the role, or to help transition it into something new, and that he really hoped that was what The Simpsons would do. He said he wanted to see South Asian writers brought into the room, not in a token way, but genuinely informing whatever direction the character took going forward, including how it was voiced. That statement in early 2018 was significantly more substantive than anything Groening had said. But Azaria was not yet ready to announce a firm decision, and the show was not yet ready to make one. The situation remained unresolved through 2018 and into 2019, with Apu continuing to appear in episodes, though with noticeably reduced prominence, as if the writers were uncertain what to do with him and had defaulted to keeping him present but quiet while they figured it out. The firm announcement came in January of 2020. Azaria confirmed publicly that he would no longer voice Apu. The statement he gave at the time was simple and direct. He said he had spent the past few years really thinking about this, listening to South Asian people, and that it was clear that the most important thing was to listen to the Indian community and their experience with the character. He did not frame the decision as something that had been forced on him. He framed it as something he had arrived at through a process of education and reflection. But the most significant and revealing moment in Azaria's public engagement with the Apu controversy came more than a year after he had stepped down from the role. In April of 2021, Azaria appeared on a podcast called Armchair Expert, hosted by actor Dax Shepard and his producing partner Monica Padman, who is the daughter of Indian immigrants. The conversation was long, detailed, and remarkably candid. It remains the most thorough public accounting that any individual directly associated with the Apu character has given of what the character meant and what voicing it for 30 years represented. Azaria told the podcast that he had spent years working to understand the impact of the character. He said the process had been slow and difficult, and had required him to confront assumptions he had not known he was carrying. He said he had read extensively, spoken to Indian American community members, attended seminars, and had conversations with people whose lives had been directly affected by the character. He said that one of the most formative experiences in that process had been a conversation with an Indian American teenager who had been in tears as he described what growing up with Apu as the primary representation of his community had meant. The teenager had pleaded with Azaria to take the message back to Hollywood, to make the case that representation mattered, and that what was put on screen had real consequences for real people. Azaria said that through that process he had come to understand that he had been, in his words, passing along structural racism as perfectly as it was possible to do. He said he had drawn on Peter Sellers' brownface performance without questioning what that lineage meant. He said he had been unaware of the relative advantage he had received as a white kid from Queens, and had not thought carefully about what it meant to take a role that an Indian actor could have played. He said he had not known any better, and that not knowing any better was not an excuse but an explanation of how something like this could persist for as long as it did. And then he said something that no one else connected to the show or the character had said publicly at any point in the entire history of the controversy. He said that part of him felt like he needed to go to every single Indian person in the country and personally apologize. He said that sometimes when the subject came up in conversation, he did exactly that. He apologized to Monica Padman directly during the podcast recording, saying he knew she had not asked for the apology, but that it was important to him to offer it anyway. He said, "I apologize for my part in creating that and participating in that." The contrast between that statement and Matt Groening's "people love to pretend they are offended" comment from 3 years earlier was stark enough that several outlets noted it directly in their coverage of the podcast. The creator of the show and the actor most responsible for the character's sound had ended up in places so different from each other that it was difficult to remember they had been part of the same production for the same 3 decades. Azaria also spoke on the podcast about the personal process that had made his reckoning possible. He said, with considerable openness, that getting sober had been a crucial factor. He said that if he had not been sober during the period when the controversy intensified, he was certain he would have responded to the criticism with defensiveness, that it would not have taken much for him to fire off a reactive and dismissive statement that he would have regretted. Sobriety had given him the tools to sit with discomfort rather than react to it, to listen rather than defend, to go through a process of genuine reflection rather than circling the wagons around his own position. What Azaria described on that podcast was not a simple or comfortable journey. It was a multi-year process of education and emotional reckoning that had required him to substantially revise his understanding of his own role in something that had caused harm. He did not present it as complete. He did not suggest that his apology resolved anything, or that stepping down from the role had fixed the underlying problem. He presented it as a process that was still ongoing, that had changed him, and that he was committed to continuing. The long road from the documentary's release in 2017 to Azaria's apology in 2021 ran through every public statement both men made, every interview, every moment of defensiveness, and every moment of genuine engagement. At the end of it, the creator of the character and the voice of the character had arrived at positions that were almost impossible to reconcile with each other. One had decided that the criticism was largely pretense, and that the show had acted in good faith throughout. The other had decided that good faith intentions and genuine harm were not mutually exclusive, and that acknowledging the harm was more important than defending the intentions. Apu himself, the character at the center of all of it, had by this point largely disappeared from the show. Not formally retired, not recast, not given a farewell storyline. Simply present less and less frequently, his appearances reduced to near nothing as the writers navigated the impossibility of using him without reigniting a conversation they had never managed to resolve. The man behind his voice had apologized to every Indian person he could reach. The man who had given him his name had not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 5 followed the deeply divergent paths of Matt Groening and Hank Azaria through the years of the Apu controversy, from dismissal on one side and genuine reckoning on the other. Next, we pull back from Apu specifically and look at the broader casting reckoning that swept through The Simpsons in 2020, when the show announced it would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters, and what that decision meant for the show's existing cast and its audience. Section 6. White actors, non-white characters. The broader casting reckoning. There are moments in the history of a long-running institution when a single decision made under pressure and announced in a handful of sentences reveals just how much had been left unaddressed for a very long time. The announcement that The Simpsons made in June of 2020 was one of those moments. In a brief statement released by the show's producers, the people responsible for one of the longest-running and most-watched animated series in television history said that going forward, white actors would no longer voice non-white characters on the program. The statement was short. It did not contain an apology. It did not name specific characters or specific actors. It did not explain in detail how the transition would work or what timeline the show was operating on. It simply stated the new policy and left the implications to be worked out in the episodes and months that followed. To understand why that announcement landed the way it did, and why it generated the range of responses it generated, it helps to understand the specific moment in which it was made. June of 2020 was not a routine month in American cultural and political life. George Floyd had been killed by police in Minneapolis on May 25th of that year, and the weeks that followed had seen protests across the United States and around the world on a scale that had not been seen in decades. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had existed for years, entered a new phase of public visibility and mainstream engagement. Institutions across American culture, from corporations to universities, to media organizations to entertainment companies, were issuing statements, making commitments, and announcing changes with a speed and a volume that reflected both genuine reckoning and considerable pressure to be seen to be doing something. In that context, The Simpsons' announcement about voice casting was one of dozens of similar announcements coming from animated shows at around the same time. Family Guy announced that the character of Cleveland Brown, a black character who had been voiced by white actor Mike Henry since the show's beginning in 1999, would be recast with a black voice actor. Big Mouth on Netflix replaced Jenny Slate, a white actress, with Ayo Edebiri as the voice of Missy, a mixed-race character. Central Park on Apple TV Plus saw several white cast members step down from roles voicing characters of color. The wave of recasting decisions swept through American animation with remarkable speed, and The Simpsons, which had been at the center of the race and representation conversation for 3 years by this point because of the Apu controversy, was both a participant in that wave and, given its history, a particularly scrutinized one. The characters most immediately affected by the policy change at The Simpsons were the ones whose situations were most clearly analogous to Apu's. Characters of color who had been voiced by white actors for decades. The first and most prominent of these after Apu himself was Carl Carlson. Carl had been a recurring character on the show since its earliest seasons, appearing as one of Homer's closest friends and co-workers at the Springfield nuclear power plant. He was black, and he had been voiced for most of the shows run by Hank Azaria, the same actor who had voiced Apu. The casting of Azaria as Carl had received almost none of the scrutiny that his voicing of Apu had generated, perhaps because Carl's character was not built around ethnic stereotype in the same explicit way that Apu's was. Carl spoke without an exaggerated accent. His blackness was not the organizing principle of his character in the way that Apu's Indian identity was the organizing principle of his. But he was a black character voiced by a white actor, and the new policy addressed that directly. At the start of the show's 32nd season in the fall of 2020, Carl Carlson was voiced for the first time by Alex Desert, a black actor who had previously been known for his work in the television series Becker and the film Swingers. Desert also took over from Azaria as the voice of Officer Lou, another black character who had been among Azaria's many recurring roles. The transition happened without significant on-screen acknowledgement. The show simply moved forward with the new voice, and audiences adjusted, or did not according to their own inclinations. A few episodes into that same season, Bumblebee Man, a Latino character who had appeared on the show since Season 2 as the star of a Spanish-language television program within the world of Springfield, was recast as well. The character had been voiced by Hank Azaria, and his replacement was Eric Lopez, a Cuban-born actor who had done voice work for several prominent video games. Again, the transition was handled quietly without ceremony or extended explanation. The recasting that generated the most public discussion, however, was the one involving Dr. Julius Hibbert. Hibbert was one of the most significant recurring characters in the show's history, Springfield's primary physician, a warm and jovial figure who had appeared in hundreds of episodes across more than 30 years. He had been voiced since his introduction in Season 2 by Harry Shearer, one of the show's original and most important cast members. Shearer was responsible for an enormous range of characters on the show, including Mr. Burns, Principal Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Waylon Smithers, and Reverend Lovejoy, among many others. He was, alongside Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner, one of the foundational voices of the entire production. The announcement that Shearer would no longer voice Dr. Hibbert was made in February of 2021. Shearer's final episode in the role was one titled Diary Queen, the 16th episode of Season 32. Beginning with the following episode titled WAD Goals, the character was voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson, a black actor with an extensive career in animation who had already appeared in more than 70 episodes of The Simpsons in various smaller roles. Richardson was a respected and experienced voice actor, known for his work on Family Guy, American Dad, and numerous other animated productions, as well as for an Emmy nomination for his work on the Netflix animated series F is for Family. The recasting of Dr. Hibbert was received differently by different parts of the show's audience, and by different members of its cast. Many viewers welcomed it as an overdue correction, a belated acknowledgement that a black character should be voiced by a black actor, and that the show's long reliance on white actors for non-white roles had been a structural problem worth addressing regardless of how long it had been in place. Others were more skeptical, questioning whether a recasting that happened under public pressure rather than as a proactive choice carried the same moral weight as one that might have been made earlier and voluntarily. Harry Shearer's own response to being replaced added a layer of complexity that kept the conversation going well beyond the initial announcement. Shearer did not express his feelings about the recasting immediately, but in a 2024 interview with the Times of London, he spoke about it with a candor that generated considerable coverage. He said that folk had been saying the show had become woke in recent years, and that one of his characters had been affected by that shift. He explained how he had approached the role of Dr. Hibbert. He had based the character on Bill Cosby, who had been widely described in American culture as the whitest black man on television, a designation that reflected both Cosby's particular public persona and the specific way that persona had been received by white American audiences. Shearer said that he had always understood his portrayal of Dr. Hibbert as a specific comedic choice rooted in that Cosby reference, that the joke of the character was in some ways the joke of a black professional who had been absorbed so completely into a particular vision of respectable American middle-class life that his blackness was present but de-emphasized. He then described what had happened after his replacement with Richardson, in terms that became widely quoted and widely debated. He said, I received an email saying they had employed a black actor who then copied my voice. The result is a black man imitating a white man imitating the whitest black man on television. That sentence is remarkable for several reasons, and it is worth spending some time with it. On one level, it is a genuine observation about a genuinely strange situation. The specific chain of imitation that Shearer describes is real. Richardson did model his version of Dr. Hibbert on Shearer's existing performance, which was itself modeled on Bill Cosby's public persona, which was itself a particular kind of performance of blackness, shaped by and for a predominantly white mainstream American audience. The layers of mediation involved are legitimately unusual. Shearer was not wrong that something strange had happened in the transition. But the framing of the observation matters as much as the observation itself. By describing the situation primarily as an absurdity, primarily as a strange loop of imitation rather than as a reasonable response to a genuine problem, Shearer's comment placed itself in a similar rhetorical position to Groening's earlier dismissals. It engaged with the mechanics of the situation, while declining to engage with the underlying question of why a black character had been voiced by a white actor for 30 years in the first place. The weirdness of the specific chain of imitation that resulted from the recasting was, in significant part, a consequence of choices that had been made at the beginning of the character's existence, not choices that the recasting had introduced. Shearer had also spoken earlier, in August of 2020, when the recasting policy was first announced, about his broader view of the question. He had said on Times Radio that he had a very simple belief about acting. The job of an actor is to play someone they are not. That statement reflected a genuine and widely held position within the acting profession, one that had been the dominant view for decades and that had allowed actors of all backgrounds to play characters very different from themselves. It was a defensible position on its own terms. But it also applied specifically to the case of a white actor voicing a black character on a show where no black writers had historically been in the room to shape that character, missed the specific way that the argument had been made against characters like Apu and Dr. Hibbert. The criticism was not that acting required authentic identity between actor and character. The criticism was that a system in which white actors routinely voiced non-white characters, while non-white actors were not correspondingly given access to white roles at the same rate, was a system that reflected and reinforced existing inequalities in the entertainment industry. The 2020 announcement and the recasting decisions that followed it also raised questions about characters that the policy did not immediately address. Apu himself had still not been recast by the time the broader policy was announced. Azaria had stepped down in January of 2020, and Groening had said publicly that the character would remain on the show, but no replacement voice actor had been named. In practice, the character had simply stopped appearing with any regularity. The show appeared to have made a quiet decision that the situation around Apu was too complicated to resolve through recasting alone, and that the least disruptive path forward was to allow the character to fade from prominence without making a formal announcement about his future. There were also smaller non-white characters across the show's enormous cast, whose situations the 2020 policy implicitly addressed, but whose specific recasting received less public attention. Characters who had appeared in dozens or even hundreds of episodes over the years, voiced by white actors, were gradually transitioned to actors from the appropriate communities. Some of these transitions happened smoothly and were barely noticed by the general audience. Others created small pockets of discussion among dedicated fans of the show who had grown attached to specific vocal performances. The broader cultural significance of the 2020 recasting wave, of which The Simpsons was a prominent part, has been debated extensively in the years since it happened. Critics of the recasting decisions have argued that they were primarily performative, that they addressed a visible and relatively easy-to-change aspect of representation without touching the deeper structural questions about who writes for these shows, who produces them, and whose perspectives shape the stories they tell. Changing the voice of a character, this argument goes, does not change the way the character is written. And if the writing continues to be done by rooms that lack meaningful diversity, the recasting is largely cosmetic. Supporters of the decisions have argued that visibility matters at every level, that hearing a black actor voice a black character and a Latino actor voice a Latino character sends a signal about whose voices and whose labor belong in these spaces, and that structural change and representational change are not mutually exclusive but often go together. They have also argued that the practical effect of the recasting decisions was to open up work for actors from communities that had historically been excluded from this particular sector of the entertainment industry, and that even if the change was incomplete change is better than no change. What is clear, looking at the full arc of the recasting decisions at The Simpsons, is that they did not emerge from a proactive commitment to representation. They emerged from years of public pressure, a landmark documentary, widespread criticism of a specific character, and ultimately the particular cultural moment created by the protests of summer 2020. The show did not lead on this question. It followed slowly and under considerable external pressure, and its following was uneven and complicated by the public statements of key figures who were not entirely convinced the changes were necessary. The Springfield that existed after the recasting decisions was nominally more representative than the one that had existed before them. Whether it was substantively more representative in the ways that matter most was a question that the recasting decisions alone could not answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 6 examined the 2020 recasting wave at The Simpsons, from the policy announcement through the specific transitions of Carl Carlson, Dr. Hibbert, and Bumblebee Man, and the complicated responses those transitions generated. Next, we travel to a specific episode that had been causing a different kind of controversy for years before any of this happened. The Japan episode that never aired in Japan, and what its treatment of an entire nation reveals about how the show handled cultures it found exotic. Section 7. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo. The Japan episode. There is a particular kind of comedy that relies on the audience sharing a specific set of assumptions about the people being depicted. It does not need to explain its jokes, because the jokes are built on associations that the audience already carries. The humor does not come from observation or from genuine engagement with the subject. It comes from confirmation. From the pleasure of seeing what you already believed about a group of people reflected back at you in an exaggerated form, and having that reflection validated by laughter. This kind of comedy has a long history in American entertainment, and it is a kind of comedy that The Simpsons returned to with some regularity when it turned its attention toward countries and cultures that were not white and Western. The episode that makes this dynamic most visible, and that generated the most significant international consequences of any single episode in the show's history related to the treatment of non-white cultures, is the Season 10 finale that aired on May 16, 1999. Its title is 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, and it has never been broadcast on Japanese television. It has never been released on home media in Japan. It exists for Japanese audiences as a kind of ghost episode, something that is known to exist but that the country it depicts has collectively decided it would rather not see. To understand why that outcome came about, and what it reveals about the show's relationship to race and cultural representation, it is necessary to go back to the episode itself and examine it carefully. Not just the moments that caused the most obvious offense, but the overall architecture of how the episode was constructed, what assumptions it was built on, and what those assumptions reveal about how the writers understood Japan and Japanese people at the time of its production. The episode begins in Springfield, with the Simpson family in financial difficulty, after Homer falls victim to an internet scam that drains the family's savings. Looking for a cheap vacation option, they discover that unclaimed airline tickets can be obtained at the airport, and by chance they end up with tickets to Tokyo. The premise is functional and gives the episode a reason to relocate the family to Japan, which is what the episode is really interested in doing. From the moment the Simpsons arrive in Tokyo, the episode operates almost entirely as a series of sketches built around Japanese cultural elements that the writers found strange, amusing, or worthy of exaggeration. Some of what the episode depicts is relatively benign in its comedic intent. The family encounters Japan's famously advanced toilet technology, which was genuinely unusual from the perspective of American audiences in 1999, and which the episode uses for straightforward fish-out-of-water comedy. They attend an ikebana class, a traditional Japanese flower arranging practice, which is played primarily for the comedy of Homer's inability to follow delicate instructions. They eat at a restaurant that serves a kind of conveyor belt sushi, which was not yet common in the United States at the time, and which the episode treats as charmingly exotic. These elements, taken in isolation, are not dramatically different from the kind of gentle cross-cultural comedy that travel-themed episodes of any long-running sitcom might produce. But the episode does not stay in the territory of gentle cross-cultural comedy. As it develops, the humor becomes increasingly reliant on a specific set of associations about Japan and Japanese culture that go beyond fish-out-of-water awkwardness and into something closer to caricature. The episode includes a scene involving a factory where Hello Kitty products are made, and the joke of the scene is that the factory produces the merchandise by burning live cats. The joke draws on the name of the product, plays on Western associations between Japan and a particular kind of cute but strange cultural production, and delivers its punchline by suggesting something grotesque about how that production happens. Whether or not the joke was intended maliciously, what it does functionally is reinforce a particular image of Japan as a place where familiar Western products are produced through unfamiliar and disturbing processes, where the cute surface conceals something darker underneath. The episode also includes a scene involving a Japanese television game show, and here the episode moves into territory that generated some of its most significant criticism. The game show in the episode is called the Happy Smile Super Challenge Family Wish Show, a name that itself relies on a particular set of assumptions about Japanese entertainment, specifically the assumption that Japanese game shows are defined by a combination of forced cheerfulness and sadistic physical challenge. The show within the show subjects its contestants to various forms of physical discomfort and humiliation in pursuit of prizes, and the humor of the sequence relies entirely on the idea that this is what Japanese entertainment looks like: bizarre, extreme, cheerfully cruel, and fundamentally alien to the sensibilities of the American family watching from the inside. This is a well-established American comedic and media trope about Japanese game shows, one that had been circulating in American popular culture for years before this episode was made, and that has continued to circulate in various forms since. The trope has been discussed and criticized by scholars of media and of American representations of Japan because of what it does to the way American audiences understand Japanese culture. It takes a real phenomenon, the existence of physically challenging game show formats that were more common on Japanese television than on American television at the time, and extrapolates from it a generalized image of Japanese entertainment as a space of organized cruelty that the Japanese themselves apparently find normal and enjoyable. The specificity disappears. What remains is an image. Japan is a place where strange and uncomfortable things happen to people in front of audiences, and where this is somehow characteristic of the culture itself. What generated the most serious and lasting offense in the episode, however, was neither the Hello Kitty factory nor the game show. It was a scene involving the Emperor of Japan. In the scene, Homer Simpson encounters the Emperor, who in the world of the episode is attending some kind of public event. Homer, characteristically oblivious to social and cultural protocol, physically picks up the Emperor and throws him into a large container filled with sumo wrestler undergarments. The scene is played as slapstick. Homer does not know he is doing something wrong. The show moves on without lingering on any consequences. In Japan, representations of the Emperor are subject to a level of cultural sensitivity that has no direct equivalent in American cultural life. The imperial family occupies a position in Japanese culture that is simultaneously ceremonial, historical, and deeply symbolic. Public depictions of the emperor that are disrespectful or degrading are not simply considered rude or in poor taste. They are considered by a significant portion of the Japanese public and by the norms of Japanese media and cultural production to be a serious transgression. The specific nature of what Homer does in the scene, physically manhandling the Emperor and depositing him in a container of sumo undergarments, was about as direct a violation of those cultural norms as it was possible to construct in an animated comedy. The decision not to air the episode in Japan was not a bureaucratic ruling from a government censor. It was a decision made by the broadcasters responsible for airing The Simpsons in Japan, reflecting their judgment that the content was too likely to cause serious offense to broadcast. The episode was also withheld from home media releases of the show in Japan. The result is that an entire season of the show, Season 10, exists in a different form for Japanese audiences than it does for audiences in the rest of the world. The season in Japan simply does not contain its own finale. The show jumps from the penultimate episode to the beginning of Season 11, and 30 Minutes Over Tokyo exists in a kind of official erasure that is different in character from the erasure of the Michael Jackson episode or the quiet disappearance of Apu. But that belongs to the same general pattern of the show producing content that eventually had to be removed or withheld because of the harm it caused. The episode was also banned from broadcast in South Korea, though for a different reason. The tensions between South Korea and Japan rooted in 20th century history, specifically Japan's colonial occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945, mean that episodes centered on Japanese culture and particularly on celebratory or sympathetic depictions of Japanese cultural life are received with sensitivity by South Korean audiences and broadcasters. An episode that spent its entire runtime immersed in Japanese cultural settings, even one that was primarily satirical in its intent, was judged to be inappropriate for South Korean broadcast given those historical tensions. The episode did air in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, though its reception in those territories was shaped by the same general awareness of Japan-related sensitivities that affected its reception elsewhere in East Asia. In each case, the decision about whether to air the episode was made by local broadcasters, weighing the specific cultural and historical context of their audience against the content of what was being shown. In the United States, the critical reception of the episode at the time of its original broadcast in 1999 was largely positive. The writers and producers who worked on it spoke about it in the audio commentary included on the DVD release with evident affection. One reviewer quoted in the Simpsons wiki described it as a magnificent end to the season, while also acknowledging that it was thoroughly racist. That pairing of adjectives, magnificent and thoroughly racist, is itself revealing. It reflects a critical posture that was relatively common in discussions of The Simpsons during this period, one that treated the show's intelligence and its offensiveness as separate tracks that could be evaluated independently, as if a piece of entertainment could be simultaneously excellent and thoroughly racist without the racism affecting the quality of the excellence. Professor Thomas Gold of the University of California at Berkeley wrote an academic paper about the episode that examined it through the lens of how popular media communicates cultural biases. Gold's analysis focused on what the episode revealed about American perceptions of Japan and of American cultural dominance more broadly. He argued that the episode was most interesting not for what it said about Japanese people, but for what it said about American assumptions. The assumption that American cultural norms were the standard against which all other cultures were measured and found wanting or amusing. The assumption that the strangeness of other cultures was an appropriate subject for comedy without any reciprocal examination of the strangeness of the culture doing the laughing. The episode also drew on a specific historical context in American culture. The 1980s had seen a wave of American anxiety about Japanese economic power, as Japanese corporations expanded significantly into American markets, and American popular culture produced a range of films and other media that reflected a mixture of fascination, admiration, and unease about Japan's global influence. Movies like Gung-Ho and Rising Sun, and the broader phenomenon of American interest in Japanese business practices, had created a cultural backdrop in which Japan was simultaneously admired for its economic success and treated as fundamentally alien and unknowable. By 1999, that specific anxiety had faded somewhat, but the cultural residue it had left, the collection of associations and images that American popular culture had built up around Japan across the previous 2 decades, remained available as material for comedy. What 30 Minutes Over Tokyo did was reach into that collection of associations and use them as the primary comedic engine of an entire episode. The Japan of the episode is not a place that the writers had engaged with deeply or tried to understand on its own terms. It is a collection of things that American audiences recognized as Japanese: the toilets, the game shows, the robots, the sushi, the fish markets, the sumo wrestlers, the ancient traditions sitting awkwardly alongside hyper-modern technology. Each of these elements is real. Japan does have advanced toilet technology. Japanese game shows do sometimes involve physical challenges. These are not invented stereotypes in the way that some of the associations built into the Apu character were invented, but assembling them into a single episode and deploying them as the raw material for comedy without any counterweight of genuine human complexity produces something that functions as stereotype regardless of whether the individual elements are accurate. A portrait painted entirely from the most exotic available details is not a portrait of a place. It is a portrait of how a place looks from a very specific and very distant vantage point. The episode's lasting significance in the context of The Simpsons' history of racial and cultural controversy is that it demonstrates the pattern was not limited to the treatment of American minority communities. The same tendency that produced Apu, the tendency to reach for the most recognizable and most easily caricatured associations when depicting a non-white, non-Western community, was present in how the show handled cultures beyond its domestic context as well. The humor of Apu relied on the audience's shared assumptions about Indian immigrants in America. The humor of 30 Minutes Over Tokyo relied on the audience's shared assumptions about Japan. In both cases, the show was not examining those assumptions, it was performing them. And in both cases, the people most affected by the performance had very little power to shape it, or respond to it through the channels that the show's creators were paying attention to. The decision by Japanese broadcasters not to air the episode was, in its quiet way, one of the most significant responses that any community depicted in The Simpsons ever managed to produce. It did not generate a documentary. It did not produce a public debate in the American media. It simply resulted in an episode of one of the world's most watched television programs being permanently unavailable in the country it depicted. That outcome, arrived at without fanfare or extended negotiation, says something about the real-world weight that these representational choices carry. Comedy has consequences, images have weight, and a show powerful enough to shape how millions of people see the world is also powerful enough to cause serious harm when that shaping is careless. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 7 examined 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, the episode that never aired in Japan, and traced the specific choices that made it offensive enough to be permanently withheld from the country it depicted. Next, we move to a different kind of censorship and a different kind of cultural sensitivity, looking at the episodes that Disney quietly removed from streaming in Hong Kong under pressure from Chinese authorities, and what those removals reveal about how the show's content intersects with real political and racial power. Section 8. The China episodes and Disney's quiet removals. There is a version of censorship that happens loudly, with announcements and protests and public debate about where the lines of acceptable expression should be drawn. And then there is a version that happens quietly, with no press release and no explanation, where a piece of content simply disappears from a platform one day, and the only way to know it is gone is to go looking for it and find that it is no longer there. The second version is in some ways more unsettling than the first, because it happens without any of the friction that might allow it to be examined or challenged. It is censorship that presents itself as housekeeping. A streaming library updated, a catalog adjusted, nothing to see, nothing to discuss, the content simply no longer available in a particular territory for reasons that the platform declines to explain in detail. This is what happened to at least 2 episodes of The Simpsons on the Disney Plus streaming platform in Hong Kong. The removals happened at different times in response to different pieces of content, and for reasons connected to the specific political situation in Hong Kong following the implementation of China's national security law in 2020. But taken together, they form a story that belongs in any serious examination of the show's history of racial and cultural controversy. Because what they reveal is something about the intersection of comedy, representation, political power, and corporate interest that goes considerably deeper than the question of whether a joke was in poor taste. To understand the context in which these removals happened, it is necessary to spend some time with the specific political situation in Hong Kong during this period. Hong Kong had operated under a framework known as one country, two systems since its handover from British to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. Under that framework, Hong Kong maintained a separate legal system, separate civil liberties protections, and a degree of political autonomy that was not present in mainland China. The arrangement was always understood to be temporary, scheduled to remain in place until 2047, but the pace at which it was being eroded became a matter of intense political conflict in the years leading up to 2020. Large-scale protests in Hong Kong in 2019, triggered initially by a proposed extradition law that would have allowed residents to be sent to mainland China for trial, evolved into a broader movement demanding democratic reforms and the preservation of Hong Kong's distinct political identity. The Chinese government's response to those protests culminated in the National Security Law, implemented in June of 2020, which criminalized a broad range of activities defined as secession, subversion, terrorism, or collusion with foreign forces. The law gave Chinese authorities sweeping powers to prosecute political dissent in Hong Kong, and significantly changed the legal environment for media, publishing, and cultural production in the territory. International companies operating in Hong Kong, including major entertainment and technology corporations, found themselves navigating a situation in which content that had previously been freely available might now fall into legally or politically sensitive territory under the new framework. Disney, which had launched its Disney Plus streaming service in Hong Kong in 2021, was among the companies that had to make decisions about what content to make available in the territory given the new legal environment. The company had substantial business interests in both mainland China and Hong Kong, including the Shanghai Disney Resort, which had opened in 2016 and represented a significant investment in the Chinese market. Those interests created a financial incentive to maintain good relations with Chinese authorities that was independent of any specific content dispute. The decisions Disney made about what to include and what to remove from its Hong Kong streaming catalog need to be understood in that context. The first episode of The Simpsons to be removed from Disney Plus in Hong Kong was from season 16 of the show, which had aired in the United States in 2005. The episode in question, titled Goo Goo Gai Pan, involves the Simpson family traveling to China with Selma Bouvier, who is attempting to adopt a baby girl through the Chinese government's international adoption program. The episode takes the family through various locations in China, including Beijing, and its humor draws extensively on the same mechanism that drove 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, the deployment of a collection of recognizable cultural associations about China as the raw material for comedic set pieces. But Goo Goo Gai Pan goes further than 30 Minutes Over Tokyo in one specific and significant way. Where the Japan episode's most offensive moments were directed at cultural practices and at the emperor as a symbolic figure, the China episode directly engages with specific moments of Chinese political history, and specifically with the Chinese government's relationship to those moments. Most significantly, the episode includes a scene set in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, one of the most symbolically loaded locations in modern Chinese and global history. In the scene, a sign is visible that reads, "On this site in 1989, nothing happened." The Tiananmen Square massacre of June 1989, in which Chinese military forces killed an unknown number of pro-democracy protesters who had been occupying the square for weeks, is one of the most significant and most politically sensitive events in modern Chinese history. The Chinese government has never officially acknowledged the scale of the violence, has never released comprehensive figures on the number of people killed, and has consistently suppressed public discussion of the event within China. The phrase "nothing happened" in the context of a sign in Tiananmen Square is a direct and pointed joke about that suppression. It references the fact that the Chinese government's official position on what occurred in the square in 1989, essentially one of denial, of erasure, of the event being treated in official discourse as something that either did not happen or did not happen in the way that witnesses, journalists, and historians have documented. It is an intelligent joke. It is the kind of politically precise comedy that The Simpsons had built its reputation on during its peak years, the kind of joke that required the audience to know something about the world, and that rewarded that knowledge with a laugh that carried genuine critical weight. It is also a joke that the Chinese government, and by extension Chinese-aligned authorities in Hong Kong under the national security law framework, would find deeply objectionable. Not because it is inaccurate, but precisely because it is accurate, because it points directly at the gap between official narrative and historical reality that the Chinese government has spent decades trying to maintain. The episode was removed from Disney Plus in Hong Kong in November of 2021. The removal was first reported by the Financial Times, which noted that the episode was no longer available on the platform in the territory. Disney did not issue a public statement explaining the removal. The company did not respond to media requests for comment with any substantive explanation of why the episode had been taken down or what process had led to the decision. The episode simply disappeared from the catalog available to Hong Kong subscribers, and the only confirmation that something had changed came from journalists and subscribers who noticed its absence and reported on it. The second removal happened in early 2023 and involved a more recent episode. The episode from season 34 of the show, entitled One Angry Lisa, had first aired in October of 2022. It involves Marge Simpson becoming involved in an indoor cycling exercise class, and during the class the instructor shows the participants images of various global landmarks and locations as a form of visual motivation. When the image of the Great Wall of China appears, the instructor delivers a line describing the wonders of China, including Bitcoin mines and forced labor camps where children make smartphones. This joke is doing something different from the Tiananmen Square reference in Goo Goo Gai Pan. Where that earlier joke was historical, pointing at a specific event in 1989, this joke from 2022 is contemporary. It references the specific accusations that human rights organizations, Western governments, and investigative journalists had been making about conditions in the Xinjiang region of China, where the Chinese government had been detaining large numbers of Uyghur Muslims in facilities that critics described as concentration camps or forced labor camps. The Chinese government denied these characterizations. International human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, had issued extensive reports documenting what they described as systematic detention, forced labor, and cultural repression. Western governments, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union, had characterized the situation in Xinjiang using terms including crimes against humanity and, in the case of the United States government, genocide. The joke in One Angry Lisa places The Simpsons squarely within that international political debate, on the side of those making accusations against the Chinese government. It is not a subtle joke. It is not a joke that leaves room for ambiguity about where the show's sympathies lie. It describes forced labor camps where children make smartphones as a wonder of China to be shown to exercise class participants as motivational imagery. And the comedy of the line comes from the collision between the cheerful framing of the instructor and the serious nature of what is being described. The episode was removed from Disney Plus in Hong Kong in early 2023, again without a public statement from Disney explaining the decision. The Financial Times, which had also reported the first removal, broke the story of the second one as well. Again, the removal was quiet. No announcement, no explanation, no public engagement with the question of why the content was being made unavailable. The two removals together raise questions that go significantly beyond the specific content of the two episodes. The most immediate question is whether Disney removed these episodes voluntarily, out of concern for its business relationships in China and Hong Kong, or whether the Chinese government or Hong Kong authorities specifically requested the removals. Disney declined to answer that question publicly in either case. It is not known, based on the public record, whether the decision to remove the episodes originated with Disney's own compliance and content teams making a proactive assessment of risk, or whether it came in response to a specific request or pressure from Chinese authorities. What is known is that the two removals happened in the context of Disney having very substantial financial interests in the Chinese market that it had reason to protect. The Shanghai Disney Resort represented billions of dollars in investment. Disney's films had been seeking Chinese distribution, and the Chinese box office had become one of the most significant revenue sources for major Hollywood productions. A company in that position making decisions about what streaming content to make available in a territory governed by a law that criminalized content the Chinese government found objectionable was making decisions in a context where the financial stakes of getting the relationship wrong were very high. This is what makes the removals relevant to a broader discussion of race, representation, and the politics of how the Simpsons content has been received and treated around the world. The Tiananmen Square joke and the forced labor camps joke are not jokes about Chinese people in the way that the Apu character was a caricature of Indian people or the Japan episode was a collection of stereotypes about Japanese culture. They are political jokes, jokes about a government and its actions, jokes that engage with human rights issues involving an ethnic and religious minority community. The Uyghur population at the center of the forced labor camps joke is itself a non-white, non-majority community, whose treatment by a government is the subject of the comedy. When Disney removed those episodes from its Hong Kong platform, it was making a decision to make content unavailable that spoke specifically about the persecution of that community. It was, whatever the specific mechanics of the decision, prioritizing its financial relationship with a government over the availability of content that criticized that government's treatment of a vulnerable population. The invisibility of the removals, the absence of any public statement or explanation, meant that the decision could not be examined or debated in the way that a more transparent choice might have been. The contrast with the handling of the Apu controversy is instructive. The Apu situation generated years of public discussion, multiple public statements from the show's creators and cast members, a formal policy change about voice casting, and eventually a public apology. The Disney Plus removals in Hong Kong generated a handful of news reports, no public statements from Disney, and no formal engagement with the questions the removals raised. One controversy was too visible to ignore, the other was managed through invisibility. There is also a broader irony present in the intersection of these two stories. The Simpsons had been criticized legitimately and extensively for producing content that caricatured and stereotyped non-white communities in ways that caused real harm. The show had been pushed slowly and under considerable pressure toward making changes that acknowledged at least some of that harm. And yet, the same show had also produced content that directly engaged with the persecution of a non-white community by a powerful government. Content that was then made unavailable in a specific territory not because it was harmful to that community, but because it was politically inconvenient for the government doing the persecuting. The show's relationship to race and to the representation of non-white communities was complicated enough to contain both of these things simultaneously. The quiet removals from Disney Plus in Hong Kong have not generated the same level of sustained public attention that the Apu controversy generated. They were covered at the time of their occurrence, and then largely moved out of the main conversation. But they belong in this story because they represent a different kind of failure. Not the failure of careless stereotyping, but the failure of institutional courage. The willingness of a large corporation to make content about racial and political persecution unavailable in order to protect its own financial position, and to do so without transparency or accountability. The Simpsons had been on television for more than 3 decades by the time the second removal happened. In that time, it had generated controversies of almost every conceivable kind. Some of those controversies had been addressed, however imperfectly. Others had been deflected. And at least 2 of them had been quietly buried in the form of episodes that simply stopped being available in the places where their content mattered most. The show that had built its reputation on being willing to say anything had, in specific circumstances and for specific reasons, allowed some of what it had said to be unsaid. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 8 traced the quiet removal of 2 The Simpsons episodes from Disney Plus in Hong Kong, examining the political and financial pressures behind those decisions and what they reveal about the intersection of corporate interests, race, and political representation. Next, we turn to the ethnic caricatures across Springfield that largely escaped the scrutiny aimed at Apu, and what their continued presence says about how selectively the show's racial history has been examined. Section 9. Springfield's other characters. The stereotypes that stayed quiet. There is something worth thinking carefully about when considering why certain controversies become national conversations and others do not. Why one character, one representation, one specific instance of stereotyping becomes the subject of a documentary and a years-long public debate, while other characters built on the same basic mechanism exist in the same show for the same length of time and generate nothing comparable in terms of organized scrutiny. The answer is rarely simple. It involves questions of scale, of visibility, of which communities have the platforms and the cultural infrastructure to make their grievances heard in spaces that decision-makers are paying attention to. It involves questions of timing, of which cultural moments create openings for certain conversations that other moments do not. And it involves questions of what gets normalized through repetition, what becomes so familiar that it stops registering as a choice and starts seeming like simply the way things are. Apu Nahasapi Mapitilan became a national conversation. The documentary got made. The debate happened loudly and publicly and eventually produced real changes at the level of casting and production policy. But Apu was not the only character in Springfield built primarily on ethnic or national stereotype. He was not even close to the only one. The town that The Simpsons constructed across more than 3 decades was populated by a remarkable collection of characters whose defining traits were drawn directly from the most familiar and most reductive associations that American popular culture had built around their respective communities. Some of those characters appeared in dozens of episodes, some appeared in hundreds. Most of them generated no documentary, no sustained national debate, no formal apology from the people responsible for their creation. They simply continued to exist, season after season, as part of the landscape of a show that had been praised for its intelligence, while rarely being asked to apply that intelligence to examining what it was doing with its non-white and non-American characters. Luigi Rizzato is one of the clearest examples. Luigi has appeared in The Simpsons since the show's earliest seasons, operating an Italian restaurant in Springfield called Luigi's. He speaks with a thick Italian accent. He is enthusiastic, demonstrative, and defined almost entirely by his professional identity as a restaurateur. His character exists within a very specific set of associations about Italian Americans in popular culture, associations that have their own long history in American entertainment, rooted in decades of Italian American characters defined by their food, their accents, their hand gestures, and their relationship to a particular kind of warm but slightly excessive emotionality. Luigi is, in the most direct possible sense, a collection of those associations given a name and a recurring role on a television program. He is not a character with a documented inner life, a backstory, a set of contradictions that make him feel like a person rather than a type. He is the Italian restaurateur, the accent, the pasta, the cheerful deference to his customers, presented week after week as a reliable source of a particular kind of comedy that does not require any examination of what it is doing. The interesting complication with Luigi is that Italian Americans are a white ethnic group, and the dynamics of how white ethnic stereotyping functions in American comedy are different in some important ways from how stereotyping of non-white communities functions. Italian Americans have faced real discrimination in American history, and have been the subject of harmful stereotyping that has caused genuine damage. At the same time, the social position of Italian Americans in contemporary American life is sufficiently integrated into mainstream white American culture that the cultural harm of a cartoon Italian restaurateur with an exaggerated accent registers differently than the cultural harm of Apu. This distinction is not a reason to ignore Luigi or to treat him as unproblematic. It is a reason to understand why the organized response to him has been different in scale and intensity from the organized response to Apu, without concluding that the difference in response reflects a difference in whether the character is built on stereotype. Bumblebee Man is a more straightforward case. The character, whose full name has been given in various episodes as Pedro Chespirito, is a recurring figure on a Spanish-language television channel that appears within the world of Springfield. He wears a bumblebee costume and performs a slapstick comedy routine that involves falling down, being hit by objects, and reacting with exaggerated physical distress to various mishaps. His name is a direct reference to Roberto Gómez Bolaños, a beloved Mexican comedian and television personality who worked under the stage name Chespirito, which means Little Shakespeare. Bolaños created a hugely popular television character called El Chavo del Ocho, who wore a similar style of costume and performed similar slapstick comedy, and who was watched by hundreds of millions of people across Latin America and in Latino communities in the United States. The decision to name the Springfield character after Bolaños and to model him on El Chavo del Ocho was clearly meant as a form of homage rather than mockery. But the execution of the character across his appearances in the show does not consistently honor that intention. Bumblebee Man exists primarily as a background figure, glimpsed on television screens within the show as a source of quick visual comedy. His Spanish-language dialogue is often played for laughs, in a way that positions the sounds of Spanish as inherently amusing to a presumed English-speaking audience. His slapstick mishaps happen without any of the genuine warmth and character development that made Bolaños' original creation so beloved by Latin American audiences. He is the surface signifiers of a specific Latin American television tradition, the costume and the falling down and the Spanish exclamations, without the human substance that made the original meaningful. For the Mexican-American and broader Latino community in the United States, Bumblebee Man occupied a similar position to Apu in some respects, a character who was nominally drawn from a real cultural tradition, who had some connection to something genuinely beloved within the community being depicted, but who existed on screen primarily as a source of comedy that did not require the audience to engage with that community on its own terms. The character was recast as part of the 2020 recasting wave, with Eric Lopez taking over the role. But unlike the Apu situation, the recasting of Bumblebee Man did not happen in the context of a sustained public debate about what the character had meant or what harm he might have caused. It happened as part of a broader policy change, applied to this character as it was applied to others, without the specific examination that the character's history might have warranted. Groundskeeper Willie is a character who complicates the picture in a different way. Willie, the Scottish groundskeeper at Springfield Elementary School, is one of the show's most beloved recurring characters and one of its most thoroughly stereotyped ones. He speaks with an exaggerated Scottish accent. He is hot-tempered, physically imposing, prone to removing his shirt to reveal an improbably muscular physique, and defined by a fierce Scottish nationalism that expresses itself in contempt for the French, a love of haggis, and a general disposition of aggressive defensiveness about Scottish identity and Scottish culture. He is, like Luigi, a white ethnic stereotype, and the same complications apply. Scotland is a nation within the United Kingdom, and Scottish people occupy a social position in the Anglophone world that is different from the social position of the communities most affected by the Simpsons' non-white character controversies. But Willie's case raises a specific question that is worth sitting with. The character's combination of physical strength, emotional volatility, working-class identity, and intense ethnic pride has been read by some Scottish viewers and commentators as a reductive and unflattering representation of Scottish masculinity. The character does not appear as a complex person who happens to be Scottish. He appears as a set of associations about Scottishness, assembled into a recurring figure whose Scottishness is always the most prominent thing about him. The question of whether this constitutes harm, in the same sense that the Apu character caused harm, is genuinely complicated. But the fact that the question has been asked so rarely in the mainstream conversation about The Simpsons' racial and cultural history says something about which communities are considered to have standing to raise these concerns, and which are considered to be safe targets for this kind of extended caricature. Cletus Spuckler is another character whose existence in the show raises questions that are rarely asked in the context of racial representation debates, but that belong in the conversation. Cletus is a recurring character described within the show as a slack-jawed yokel, a poor rural white southerner with an exaggerated southern accent, a large number of children with names that serve as jokes about rural poverty and lack of education, a lack of ambition, and a cheerful ignorance about the world beyond his immediate environment. His full name is Cletus Delroy Spuckler, and the show has used him consistently as a vehicle for comedy about poor white Southerners, a community that occupies a specific and complicated position in American cultural discourse. The question of whether poor white Southerners constitute a group whose stereotyping in popular culture causes genuine harm is one that sits at the intersection of race, class, and regional identity in ways that are genuinely complex. Poor white Southerners as a group do not face the same structural disadvantages in American society as non-white communities, and the stereotyping of that group in popular culture does not function within a broader system of racial hierarchy in the same way that the stereotyping of Apu functioned. But the character of Cletus does demonstrate that the Simpsons' habit of reaching for the most reductive available associations when constructing recurring characters was not a habit applied exclusively to non-white communities. It was a broader tendency in the show's character building, one that happened to cause the most clearly documentable harm when it was applied to communities who were already marginalized in American life. The character of Akira, Springfield's Japanese martial arts instructor, deserves consideration alongside 30 Minutes Over Tokyo as part of the show's broader pattern of depicting Asian cultures through a specific and limited lens. Akira, voiced by Hank Azaria using an exaggerated Japanese accent, appears periodically across many seasons of the show as a teacher of karate and other martial arts. His character exists almost entirely within the intersection of two specific cultural associations: Japanese culture and martial arts. He does not have the kind of developed backstory or inner life that the show gave to Apu. He exists as a functional figure, someone who teaches the characters martial arts when the plot requires it, and whose Japanese identity is present primarily in his accent and his expertise in a discipline that American popular culture has long associated with East Asian culture specifically. The character of Dr. Nick Riviera, the show's incompetent and dangerously underqualified physician, raises questions of a different kind. Doctor. Nick speaks with an accent that has been described as vaguely Latino or vaguely foreign, and his character exists as a vehicle for comedy about medical incompetence and the dangers of seeking cheap healthcare. The specific ethnicity of the character has never been definitively established within the show, which is itself a choice worth noting. The character is clearly marked as foreign, as not fully American, and that foreignness is part of what makes him comedically available as a figure of incompetence. The willingness to use vague ethnic otherness as a shorthand for untrustworthiness or incompetence, even without specifying the exact nature of that otherness, is a pattern that has appeared in American entertainment for a very long time, and that The Simpsons participates in through this character without the show or its creators ever having been asked to examine that participation seriously. What all of these characters share taken together is membership in a category of recurring figures who were built on the same basic mechanism as Apu, but who existed at the periphery of the controversy that eventually gathered around him. They were not the subject of documentaries. They did not produce national debates. The communities they depicted did not, in most cases, produce the kind of organized and sustained public response that Hari Kondabolu's work represented, and so they continued to appear in Springfield, season after season, as part of the background texture of a world that the show's creators had never been comprehensively asked to examine. This uneven pattern of scrutiny is itself revealing. It suggests that the reckoning The Simpsons underwent in the years following the 2017 documentary was not a comprehensive examination of the show's racial and cultural history. It was a response to the specific pressure that had been generated around the specific character that had become the focus of organized advocacy. The changes that resulted, the recasting decisions, the reduced prominence of certain characters, the public apologies from some of the people involved were real and they mattered. But they addressed a portion of the problem rather than the whole of it. The rest of Springfield's ethnic landscape, the Luigas and the Akiras and the Bumblebee Men and the Doctor, Nick's, remained largely where they had always been, present and unremarked upon, their stereotypical architecture intact. There is a version of this observation that could be used to dismiss the Apu controversy, to argue that because the show stereotyped everyone, it was not doing anything specifically harmful to any particular community. That argument was made repeatedly by people defending the character during the debate. But the fact that a problem is widespread does not make it less of a problem in any specific instance. The fact that The Simpsons built stereotype characters across multiple communities does not reduce the harm done by any individual stereotype character. It expands the scope of the problem rather than containing it. What the full picture of Springfield's character landscape reveals is that the show's approach to ethnic and national identity was not the result of a specific animus toward any particular community. It was the result of a systematic habit of using the most available cultural shorthand when constructing characters who existed outside the show's central white American family. That habit produced Apu. It also produced Luigi and Bumblebee Man and Akira and Dr. Nick and a dozen other figures who populated the edges of Springfield with the comfortable familiarity of stereotype. The habit was never comprehensively examined. And because it was never comprehensively examined, the changes the show eventually made were partial rather than total, addressing the most visible symptoms of a deeper pattern that continued to shape the world of Springfield long after the cameras had moved on from Apu's quick E-Mart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 9 explored Springfield's broader landscape of racial and ethnic caricature, including the characters who escaped the scrutiny aimed at Apu, despite relying on many of the same stereotypes, and what that uneven response reveals about how selectively the show's racial history has been confronted. In the final section, everything comes together, where Apu stands today, what the recasting decisions actually changed, and what these controversies ultimately reveal about American television, race, and the complicated legacy of the longest-running animated series in history. Section 10. What changed, what stayed the same, and what it all means. There is a particular kind of ending that is not really an ending at all. It is the kind that arrives not through resolution, but through exhaustion, through the slow fading of a conversation that was never fully concluded, through the quiet disappearance of a problem that was never fully solved. The story of The Simpsons and its long history of racial and cultural controversy does not have a clean ending. There is no moment where the show acknowledged everything it needed to acknowledge, made every change it needed to make, and emerged on the other side as its genuinely transformed institution. What happened instead was messier and more ambiguous than that. A partial reckoning that addressed some things and left others untouched, that produced real changes in some areas and cosmetic adjustments in others, and that ultimately revealed as much about the limits of institutional self-examination as it did about the specific failures of a specific television program. To assess what actually changed and what did not, it is worth taking stock of where things stand now, more than 3 decades after Apu first appeared behind the Quickie Mart counter, and nearly a decade after Hari Kondabolu's documentary put the conversation into permanent public record. The most concrete and visible change is the one that happened to the voice cast. White actors no longer voice non-white characters on The Simpsons. That is a real change. It affects who gets paid to work on the show, whose voice and whose labor is associated with characters of color, and what signal the production sends to the broader entertainment industry about whose participation belongs in these spaces. The recasting of Carl Carlson, Hibbert, Bumblebee Man, Officer Lou, Kumiko Albertson, and other characters brought Black, Latino, and Asian actors into roles that had previously been closed to them. That matters even if it happened slowly and under considerable external pressure rather than proactively and voluntarily. The change to the voice cast is also the change that is easiest to measure and easiest to point to as evidence that something happened. It is the kind of change that can be documented in a cast list, verified against the public record, and cited as a specific response to a specific criticism. For that reason, it has tended to dominate the public accounting of what The Simpsons did in response to its racial controversies. But focusing on the voice casting change to the exclusion of other questions produces an incomplete picture of what actually changed and what did not. Apu Nahasape Maptalon himself has not been formally retired from the show. There has been no announcement that the character is gone, no farewell episode, no statement from the producers about his future. What has happened is that his appearances have become so infrequent as to be effectively non-existent. Through the seasons following the 2020 recasting announcement, Apu appeared in the background of certain scenes, present but without lines, a ghostly figure maintaining a nominal existence in Springfield while being gradually removed from the active life of the show. By the most recent seasons, even those background appearances had become rare. The character has not been recast. He has not been written out. He has simply been allowed to fade, which is perhaps the most honest reflection available of the position the show found itself in. Unable to use the character without reigniting the controversy, unwilling to formally retire him, and having found no satisfactory path between those two options. The question of what to do with Apu was never answered. It was evaded, and the evasion is itself informative. A show that had the confidence to make a knowing fourth wall break about the controversy in 2018, that had the institutional authority to announce a sweeping policy change about voice casting in 2020, did not have the creative or moral clarity to decide what Apu's future should look like. The character who had been at the center of everything simply disappeared from view, and the show moved on without ever fully accounting for what he had been or what he had done. The writer's room, which was identified early in the Apu controversy as a central part of the structural problem, has changed in some respects since the controversy began. The Simpsons has made efforts in recent years to diversify its writing staff, and the room that writes the show today is more diverse than the room that wrote it in the 1990s and 2000s. This is another real change, and it is arguably more significant in the long run than the voice casting change, because it affects not just who speaks the lines but who writes them, who decides what the characters do and say, and whose perspective shapes the stories the show tells. A writer's room that includes people from the communities the show has historically depicted through stereotype is a room better equipped to recognize when the show is repeating old habits and to push back against that repetition. But the pace of that change has been gradual, and its effects on the actual content of the show are difficult to measure from the outside. What can be observed is that the specific kind of ethnic caricature that defined characters like Apu and Luigi and Akira has become less prominent in the show's more recent seasons, though it has not disappeared entirely. Whether that shift reflects a genuine change in the values and approach of the writer's room, or simply is a wariness about generating the kind of controversy that the Apu situation produced, is a question that cannot be answered from the outside with certainty. What has not changed, or has changed only marginally, is the fundamental architecture of the show's relationship to race and representation. The Simpsons remains a show centered on a white American family navigating a world in which characters of color exist primarily as supporting figures, as sources of comedy, as elements of the background texture of Springfield rather than as full participants in the main narrative. The show's central family has been yellow since its earliest days, a creative choice that was originally made to distinguish the animated characters from real people, and that has the effect of coding the family as racially neutral in the eyes of many viewers. But the world they inhabit has never been racially neutral. The choices about which characters get complexity and interiority, which characters get to be wrong and contradictory and human, in the way that Homer is wrong and contradictory and human, have consistently reflected a particular set of assumptions about whose experience is the default experience and whose experience is the exotic variation. Those assumptions have been challenged, partially and imperfectly, by the controversies of the past decade. But challenging an assumption and dismantling it are different things, and the show has not dismantled the underlying structure that produced the problem characters in the first place. It has made adjustments at the level of individual characters and individual casting decisions. The deeper question of what kind of show The Simpsons is, whose perspective it centers, whose humanity it treats as self-evident, and whose it treats as something that needs to be explained or authenticated, remains largely unaddressed in the public conversation about its racial history. The legacy of Hank Azaria's apology deserves particular attention in any final accounting of what this history means. Azaria's journey from the creation of Apu's voice in 1989 to his apology on the Armchair Expert podcast in 2021 is in some ways the most human story in this entire narrative. It is a story about a person who did something harmful without understanding that it was harmful, who spent years being told that the harm was real, who resisted that understanding for a period while the cultural pressure mounted, and who eventually arrived, through a genuine and evidently difficult process of education and reflection, at a place of genuine accountability. The apology he gave was not a corporate statement designed by a public relations team. It was a personal reckoning offered on a podcast in the course of a long and candid conversation, and it had the texture of something that had been genuinely worked through rather than simply performed. What makes Azaria's apology significant beyond his individual case is what it suggests about the conditions under which people who participate in harmful representations can come to understand what they have done. Azaria has spoken about the role of sobriety in making his reckoning possible, about how the tools he developed through recovery gave him the capacity to sit with discomfort rather than defend against it. He has spoken about the specific conversations with specific Indian American individuals that made the abstract argument of the documentary concrete and personal for him. He has spoken about the teenager who was in tears describing what growing up with Apu as the primary representation of his community had meant. These details matter because they point towards something real about how change happens at the individual level, not through abstract arguments alone, but through the accumulation of human contact with the consequences of one's choices. Matt Groening's trajectory through the same period points towards something different, something about the conditions under which people do not arrive at that kind of reckoning, and what the absence of reckoning looks like from the outside. Groening has never apologized for Apu. He has never engaged seriously in public with the specific experiences documented in Kondabolu's film. His public statements about the controversy have moved between dismissal, qualified defense, and a kind of weary resignation, but they have not moved toward genuine accountability. The creator of the character and the voice of the character ended up in places so different from each other that the contrast itself became part of the story, a visible illustration of the fact that proximity to a controversy does not determine the response to it, and that institutional authority and creative responsibility do not automatically produce the humility that genuine reckoning requires. The broader significance of The Simpsons' racial controversies extends well beyond the specific show and its specific characters. The show was and remains one of the most influential pieces of American popular culture ever produced. The characters it created shaped how millions of people understood communities they had limited direct experience with. The images it put into circulation through decades of weekly broadcast settled into the cultural imagination with a depth and a persistence that most entertainment never achieves. When those images were reductive, when they reduced complex human communities to collections of accent marks and professional stereotypes, the reduction entered the culture with the same authority and the same reach that the show's genuine insights did. The intelligence of the show did not protect its stereotypes from causing harm. In some ways it amplified the harm, because the intelligence made the stereotypes more visible, more quotable, more deeply embedded in the cultural memory of everyone who grew up with the show. The Apu controversy and everything that followed it was, at its core, an argument about the responsibilities that come with that kind of cultural reach. A show watched by tens of millions of people every week, for decades in dozens of countries, has a relationship to the communities it depicts that is different from the relationship a small niche production has. The scale of the audience means the scale of the impact. When The Simpsons built a character on stereotype, it was not doing so in a vacuum. It was doing so in a context where that stereotyped image would reach an enormous number of people and shape, for many of them, the primary image they carried of an entire community. The Indian American community that raised the alarm about Apu was asking, essentially, for that responsibility to be acknowledged. Not for the show to be cancelled, not for its history to be erased. Not even, initially, for the character to be removed. For the responsibility to be taken seriously. For the people who had created and maintained the character to engage honestly with what it had done, and for the industry that had produced it to examine the conditions that had made such a character possible, and kept him in place for so long. The response to that ask was partial. Some of the people who should have engaged did not engage, or engaged defensively. The institutional changes that resulted were real but incomplete. The broader structural conditions that had produced not just Apu, but the whole landscape of Springfield's ethnic caricatures were addressed only at the margins. and the show itself moved on, as long-running institutions tend to do, carrying its history with it in the form of a character who is no longer fully present, but has not been fully accounted for either. What the entire history means, taken as a whole, is something about the pace at which American cultural institutions change in response to pressure from communities they have historically marginalized. It is slow, it is uneven. It is shaped by which individuals within those institutions are capable of genuine reflection, and which are not. It is shaped by the specific forms of pressure that specific communities are able to generate and sustain over time. It is shaped by the broader cultural moment, by the events that create openings for conversations that had previously been closed, by the protests and the documentaries and the social movements that shift what is possible to say and what is possible to demand. The Simpsons has been on the air for more than 35 years. The conversation about what it has done with race and representation is not over. The show is still producing new episodes. The characters who were not Apu are still in Springfield. The writer's room is more diverse than it was, but is not finished changing. The accountability that was partial rather than complete remains partial rather than complete. And the show that everyone loved and no one questioned for so long is now a show that a significant number of people love while holding a clear-eyed understanding of what it got wrong and what it has still not fully faced. That combination of genuine love for a thing and genuine honesty about its failures is perhaps the most honest place to stand in relation to any cultural institution that has been around long enough to accumulate both genuine achievement and genuine harm. The Simpsons earned its place in cultural history. It also earned every difficult question that has been asked of it. Both of those things are true, and both of them will remain true for as long as the show continues and long after it eventually ends. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.